The afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the bustling main street, painting the storefronts of the small coastal town in warm, golden hues. It was a Saturday, the one day of the week when the quiet community truly came alive, filled with the laughter of children, the chatter of shoppers, and the distinct, crisp uniforms of the United States Marines from the nearby base. Amidst this lively backdrop, two military policemen walked their beat with entirely different levels of enthusiasm. Private First Class Gomer Pyle strolled with a bright, appreciative smile, his eyes taking in the beauty of the day, while Private Ben Dzansky walked with a sharp, disciplined stride, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Gomer shook his head slowly, a look of genuine reluctance clouding his usually cheerful face as he adjusted the heavy leather belt around his waist. He looked over at his partner, his voice carrying the soft, familiar drawl of his southern home, confessing that this was the one job in the entire military that he simply did not care for, not even a single bit. Dzansky let out a short, amused breath and told him to come on, asserting that it really was not so bad if a person just kept their wits about them. But Gomer was not easily convinced, and his mind immediately drifted back to his childhood days, remembering how even when he was in the 4th grade, his teacher, Miss Thompson, used to leave the room and make him the official class monitor. The memory brought a look of gentle distress to Gomer's face as he explained how all the other kids would instantly start throwing erasers and all sorts of things the moment the teacher's back was turned. As the monitor, he was supposed to write down their names and report every single one of them, but he never could bring himself to do it. Instead, he would just run around the classroom as fast as his legs could carry him, picking up every single dropped eraser, straightening the desks, and cleaning the floors. By the time Miss Thompson walked back through the door, the entire room would look absolutely neat and perfect, and she would always stand there wondering why her little class monitor was completely out of breath and panting. Dzansky chuckled softly at the story, shaking his head with a mixture of affection and disbelief, telling Gomer that he was nothing but a big pussycat. Gomer did not mind the description at all, nodding in agreement and explaining that he simply did not like being placed in any position of authority over his fellow human beings. Dzansky sighed, reminding him that whether they liked it or not, it was their platoon's turn again to handle military police duty in town, and they simply had to do it. Just an hour earlier, back at the base, the atmosphere had been far more intense. Sergeant Vince Carter had stood before his gathered platoon, his face a mask of strict military discipline as he barked out his final instructions. He had told his people that they were all ready to shove off and asked if everyone was properly set, pausing for a brief second to sharply order a private named Fletcher to straighten his armband. Sergeant Carter had paced in front of the line, his voice echoing off the barracks walls as he reminded them that they had all performed this duty before, so they should know exactly what to look out for on the streets. The rule, as the sergeant defined it, was incredibly simple. If anybody got out of line, they were to put them on report immediately, and if the situation was serious, they were to slap them right into the brig without hesitation. Gomer, standing near the middle of the formation, had raised his hand with a look of deep confusion. Sergeant Carter had stopped dead in his tracks, staring at him, and asked what could possibly be confusing about that simple instruction. Gomer had cleared his throat, pointing out that the official regulation book explicitly stated that if a person had an explanation for their behavior, the military policemen were supposed to listen to it. Sergeant Carter had barked back that Gomer was absolutely right. They were supposed to listen to the explanation, and then they were supposed to slap them in the brig anyway. As the platoon began to move out toward the transport trucks, Gomer had jogged a few steps forward to keep pace with the furious sergeant, asking if they were not supposed to be absolutely sure that a person was guilty before they slapped them in the brig. Sergeant Carter had groaned in frustration, stating that naturally, an officer only arrests a guy if he is doing something wrong. But Gomer's mind was already spinning with hypothetical scenarios, and he asked what would happen if it looked like a person was doing something wrong, but they actually were not. Sergeant Carter had stopped, turning around to face him fully, demanding to know what on earth he was talking about. Gomer had explained that sometimes when a fight breaks out on a street corner, the fellow throwing the heaviest punches might just be defending himself against an attacker, while the fellow lying on the ground might be the very one who started the entire mess. Sergeant Carter had dismissed the philosophical dilemma instantly, telling him that in such a case, they were to haul both of them in and let the officer of the day decide who was right and who was wrong. He emphasized that their primary job was simply to clear the streets of trouble, ordering the men to move out. Still, Gomer had remained anxious, asking if they were required to use handcuffs during their patrol. Sergeant Carter had replied that if they could not control a troublemaker any other way, then yes, they should use handcuffs, using whatever equipment was necessary to maintain order. The most important thing, the sergeant had stressed, was to stay completely on top of every situation, handling it quickly and without making a fuss, because they did not want to draw any unnecessary attention to the Marine Corps, especially on a lovely Saturday afternoon when the town was always filled with a little bit of trouble. Gomer had looked down at his watch, his eyes widening as he realized the time, and had timidly called out to the sergeant once more. Sergeant Carter, nearly at the limit of his patience, had snapped, asking what it could possibly be now. Gomer had apologized for interrupting, but gently pointed out that he was afraid they were going to be late for their transport, suggesting that they really ought to get going. Sergeant Carter had merely closed his eyes, muttering to himself in deep annoyance as he led the way to the vehicles. Now, out on the bustling streets, the reality of the assignment was in full swing. Sergeant Carter walked the perimeter of the designated patrol zones, guiding the pairs of military policemen to their respective locations. He paused at a wide, busy intersection, turning to face his two subordinates. He announced to Dzansky and Gomer that this specific area was to be their post, covering the entire street from the front entrance of the Bijou Theater all the way around the block to Tony's restaurant. Sergeant Carter had then turned his full attention to Dzansky, placing a heavy, encouraging hand on the young man's shoulder, telling him that he had the utmost confidence in him because he had a level head on his shoulders, was always on the ball, and could be trusted to handle absolutely any situation that might arise. The sergeant admitted quite frankly that this was the exact reason he was pairing him up with Gomer, explaining that he firmly believed in the time-tested military strategy of teaming up complete opposites. Dzansky had smiled confidently, assuring the sergeant that he would do his part to keep the peace. Sergeant Carter had looked over at Gomer's wide, innocent grin and sighed deeply, remarking that Dzansky had no idea how much that statement failed to comfort him. Before leaving them to their duties, Sergeant Carter gave them one final warning to stay on their toes and keep a close eye on everything. Gomer had stood at attention, saluting smartly and saying yes sir, while the sergeant gave Dzansky a quiet, parting instruction to keep a very close eye on Gomer. He reminded them that if anything came up that they could not handle by themselves, they were to blow their whistles immediately, promising that he would not be far away. The moment Sergeant Carter turned his back and walked down the street with the rest of the detail, a sharp, piercing sound echoed through the air. Sergeant Carter spun around instantly, his face turning a bright shade of red as he marched back to the corner, demanding to know what Gomer was doing. Gomer had simply smiled, holding the shiny metal whistle in his hand, explaining that he was just testing it out to make sure it worked. He remarked that it had a wonderfully nice, clear sound to it, and joked that the little wooden peas inside the whistle must be brand new. Sergeant Carter had glared at him for a long, silent moment before rubbing his temples and walking away without saying another word. Not even 5 minutes had passed on their patrol when Gomer's eyes caught sight of a young Marine walking down the sidewalk toward them. Gomer tapped Dzansky on the shoulder, wondering aloud what the guy was doing. Dzansky's eyes narrowed as he noticed the uniform infraction, and he stepped forward, ordering the private to hold it right there. He looked the young man up and down, asking him firmly where his uniform cap was. The private stopped, looking nervous, and replied that he did not have it. Dzansky immediately reached for his notepad, declaring that this was uniform violation number 1. Gomer stepped in quickly, putting a hand on Dzansky's arm, suggesting that before he put the young man on the official report, they ought to give him a fair chance to explain himself. Gomer turned to the private, asking him in a gentle tone if he had an explanation for his missing cap. The private nodded eagerly, claiming that it had been stolen from him. Gomer turned back to Dzansky with a triumphant smile, arguing that if the cap was truly stolen, then it certainly was not the poor fellow's fault. Dzansky let out a frustrated sigh, asking Gomer if he was honestly going to buy a ridiculous story like that. He turned back to the private, telling him that they were not fresh out of boot camp and that they knew a phony story when they heard one, questioning who on earth goes around stealing military caps. Gomer, wanting to find the good in the situation, pondered for a moment and suggested that it could have been a notorious cap snatcher operating in the neighborhood, someone who steals them and sells them to a surplus store as stolen goods. He nodded to himself, convinced that a cap snatcher was the perfect explanation. Dzansky, playing along with deep skepticism, asked the private what this supposed cap snatcher looked like. The private stammered, admitting that he did not see the person because the thief came up right behind him, snatched the cap off his head, and was gone in a flash. Gomer smiled warmly, telling the private that he was very sorry for his bad luck and advising him to just get on back to the base real quick to get a replacement. The private looked immensely relieved, thanking them a lot, and quickly hurried down the street. Dzansky watched him go, shaking his head and admitting that he still thought they should have put the young man on report. Before Gomer could respond, a thunderous voice boomed from behind them, calling out Dzansky's name. Both military policemen spun around to see Sergeant Carter standing there, his arms crossed and a furious expression on his face. Gomer smiled cheerfully, offering a warm hello to the sergeant. Sergeant Carter pointed down the street toward the retreating private, demanding to know about the Marine who had just walked right past him without his cap. He asked fiercely if they had put him on report like they were ordered to do. Dzansky looked down, admitting that they did not. Gomer stepped forward bravely, taking full responsibility, explaining to the sergeant that he was the one who had let the private go, specifically on account of the fact that the young man had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Sergeant Carter's eyes narrowed as he demanded to know what possible explanation could justify being out of uniform. Gomer explained with complete sincerity that the poor boy was the unfortunate victim of a local cap snatcher. Sergeant Carter stared at him in utter disbelief, yelling that anyone who is out of uniform must be put on report immediately, with absolutely no questions asked. Dzansky apologized quickly, but Sergeant Carter was far from finished. The sergeant began to pace around them, painting a vivid picture of the terrible consequences of their leniency. He asked them if they knew what could happen at any moment, pointing out that Lieutenant Anderson might pass that very same guy on the street, see that he was completely out of uniform, and ask him if he had been stopped by any military policeman. The private would then have to say that yes, he was stopped, but the tall, dumb-looking one let him go. Sergeant Carter leaned in close to Gomer, asking him who he thought Lieutenant Anderson was going to chew out for that failure of duty, clarifying loudly that it would not be Gomer, but rather the sergeant himself. Gomer tried to soothe his superior's anger, stating that he really did not think there was any chance that Lieutenant Anderson would see the young man on the street because Private Finn was heading right straight back to the base. Sergeant Carter pointed a menacing finger at him, warning him that he had better be right, or there would be serious trouble to pay. At that exact moment, as if fate were playing a cruel trick, a stern voice interrupted the conversation, calling out for Sergeant Carter. The sergeant froze, his posture snapping into a rigid stance as he turned around to see Lieutenant Anderson marching toward them, accompanied by the very same capless Marine. Sergeant Carter saluted crisply, answering yes, sir. Lieutenant Anderson pointed a finger at the private, stating coldly that this Marine was clearly out of uniform and demanded to know how on earth the private had managed to slip right through the sergeant's men. Sergeant Carter, desperately trying to salvage the situation, offered a polite excuse, stating that the private was on his way back to the base to rectify the issue. Lieutenant Anderson shook his head firmly, declaring that the private was absolutely not on his way back to the base, but was instead caught walking right into the local Kit Kat club. The private looked down guiltily, muttering to Gomer that he had promised to go back, while Gomer looked back with a heartbroken expression of disappointment. Lieutenant Anderson ordered them to get with it and put the man on report immediately. Gomer nodded quickly, promising that he sure would, but Sergeant Carter intervened sharply, ordering Dzansky to handle the report instead. The sergeant then grabbed Gomer by the arm and pulled him over to the side of the sidewalk, telling him that he had better straighten his act out right this second. He warned Gomer that if he got him into any more hot water with the lieutenant, Gomer would be profoundly sorry that he was ever born. Gomer looked down at his boots, softly replying that he was already feeling quite sorry. Sergeant Carter emphasized the absolute rule of the military, stating that when a man is out of uniform, he is out of uniform, and a good military policeman does not ask any questions or listen to any phony explanations whatsoever. He demanded to know if Gomer finally understood that simple concept. Gomer nodded respectfully, saying yes, sir. The sergeant told him to get back to his post, muttering under his breath that in Gomer's specific case, the letters MP must stand for Mary Poppins. As they resumed their patrol, Gomer remained determined to do a good job, though his definition of a good job differed greatly from the sergeant's. A few minutes later, Gomer spotted another Marine walking down the sidewalk toward them, chatting happily with a young lady, but his uniform shirt was completely unbuttoned at the top. Gomer nudged his partner, noting that here came one with his shirt unbuttoned. Dzansky reached for his notepad again, but Gomer stopped him, pleading to let him handle this specific one. He promised Dzansky that this time he would be absolutely firm, begging for the chance to prove himself. Gomer stepped into the path of the couple, tipping his cap politely and excusing himself to the young lady. He turned to the young Marine, his voice carrying as much authority as he could muster, stating that the private's shirt was unbuttoned and asking him to please button it up because regulations required it. The young Marine looked down at his chest, a look of mild embarrassment on his face, and explained that the top button was completely gone, having evidently dropped off somewhere along the way. Gomer's firm demeanor instantly melted into pure sympathy. He told the young man that he was terribly sorry to hear that, but then remembered Sergeant Carter's strict lecture. He forced a stern expression back onto his face, stating that there was still no excuse for being out of uniform, no excuse at all, and warned him that a person could get into all kinds of trouble wandering around town in such a state. The young Marine began to argue, but Gomer raised a hand, telling him that a person does not argue with a military policeman and instructing the private to just come along with him. Gomer excused himself to the young lady once more and led the Marine over to a quiet spot near a storefront. The young Marine pleaded his case, arguing that it was only a single missing button and asking why Gomer could not just give him a break. Gomer turned to him, his voice soft and instructive, explaining that he had told him not to argue. Gomer smiled warmly, stating that the absolute best way to avoid trouble in this life is simply to prevent it from ever getting started in the first place. With a proud flourish, Gomer reached into his deep uniform pockets, explaining that this was precisely why he always carried around a needle, a spool of thread, and a collection of spare buttons with him wherever he went. He added happily that he also possessed some spare tie clips and a few extra razor blades in his pocket just in case the private happened to need a quick shave. Dzansky, who had been watching the entire display with growing horror, could not take it anymore. He looked down the street, spotted another Marine patrolling nearby, and urgently ordered him to go find Sergeant Carter right away. He turned back to Gomer, warning him that he was going to get them into immense trouble, shouting that they were supposed to be acting as proper military policemen, not running a local chapter of the Ladies' Aid Society. Gomer looked up from threading his needle, entirely unfazed, stating that he simply did not see anything wrong with helping a fellow Marine in distress. Dzansky threw his hands up in the air, asking him if he truly thought sewing a button on a man's shirt in the middle of a public street was appropriate behavior for an MP. Before Gomer could finish tying the knot on the newly attached button, a sudden commotion broke out just a few yards away. A loud argument erupted between a sailor and another Marine, their voices rising quickly as a crowd began to gather. Dzansky reacted instantly, rushing over to the two men who were now shoving each other roughly, shouting for them to break it up. He warned them that if they wanted to settle their differences in the brig, it was entirely all right with him. Gomer hurried over, stepping between the two angry servicemen, and gently told Dzansky that he did not think such drastic measures were necessary. He suggested that the two men just needed to be set straight with a little bit of friendly advice. Dzansky snapped back, insisting that no, they were going straight to the brig. Gomer pleaded with his partner, believing that he could smooth the whole thing out without taking any harsh actions if Dzansky would just give him a single minute. Dzansky groaned aloud, begging Gomer to stop. Gomer turned to the sailor and the Marine, looking at them with a deeply earnest expression. He told them that what they were doing at that moment was the absolute worst thing two proud servicemen could possibly do when they come into a civilian town. He asked them to consider how a disgraceful display like that must look to all the hard-working civilians watching them. Gomer explained that when a serviceman gets a weekend pass to come into town, it is a grand privilege, and it is a privilege that must be respected deeply, meaning that they had to be on their absolute best behavior at all times. Dzansky, still holding his notebook, muttered that they should just run them in so they would finally get the message. Gomer disagreed, stating that the two men were fully grown adults and that he believed they could easily understand the truth of what he was saying. Gomer smiled encouragingly, asking the two fellows to shake hands and be friends. He coaxed them gently, urging them to come on and shake hands. Under the warmth of Gomer's sincere gaze, the tension between the two men completely dissolved. The sailor and the Marine looked at each other, smiled sheepishly, and extended their hands, locking them in a firm, friendly handshake. Gomer beamed with joy, remarking that the handshake looked a whole lot better. He made them promise that there would be absolutely no more trouble between them today. He turned back to Dzansky, noting how beautiful it was to see them get along, commenting on how terrible it was to imagine two brave men in the service of their country fighting one another. Gomer waved goodbye to the two men, telling them to have a wonderful day and to be good. He turned to Dzansky with a proud grin, pointing out that they had successfully straightened the entire situation out, and they had accomplished it perfectly without having to arrest a single soul. The moment of triumph was short-lived. A familiar, ominous shadow fell over them as Sergeant Carter appeared once more, his face contorted in a mix of rage and exhaustion. Gomer waved cheerfully, saying hi to the sergeant. Sergeant Carter looked at Gomer with pure venom in his eyes, demanding to know what on earth was going on. He informed them that Lieutenant Anderson had just blasted him over the radio again. He looked at Gomer, his voice trembling with forced restraint, asking if it was true that Gomer had actually sewed a button onto a Marine's shirt in public. Gomer smiled proudly, confirming that yes, sir, he had, explaining that it was all part of their new prevention policy. Sergeant Carter could only mutter a confused sound, prompting Gomer to quote the classic proverbs, stating that a stitch in time saves 9, and an ounce of prevention is worth a whole pound of cure. Gomer explained happily that not only did they help that Marine with the missing button to keep him out of trouble, but not more than a few seconds ago, they had successfully prevented a major fight between a sailor and a Marine by simply reasoning with them, causing them to go on their way peacefully. Before Gomer could even finish his sentence, a loud crash echoed from around the corner. Both Gomer and Sergeant Carter spun around just in time to see the exact same sailor and Marine tearing into each other in a full, chaotic brawl, rolling across the sidewalk and knocking over a trash can. Lieutenant Anderson appeared from the crowd, shouting for them to knock it off and hold it right there. He turned to Sergeant Carter, ordering him fiercely to get those men off the street immediately, put them in the back of the military jeep, and take them straight to the brig. Sergeant Carter barked orders to move it, helping to haul the brawling men away. Gomer stepped forward, his face full of genuine remorse, admitting to the lieutenant that it was all his fault because they had caught those two shoving each other just a few minutes ago. Lieutenant Anderson glared at him, asking why on earth he did not arrest them right on the spot. Gomer explained softly that he had reasoned with them, and they had shaken hands and promised him faithfully that they would not fight anymore. Lieutenant Anderson turned to Sergeant Carter, delivering a cold, final ultimatum, stating that the sergeant had better do something permanent about this man, or the lieutenant would do something very permanent about the sergeant. Sergeant Carter stood stiffly, answering yes, sir. Once the lieutenant had departed, the sergeant turned to Gomer, his voice dangerously quiet. He informed Gomer that this quiet, isolated back gate of the base was to be his personal post for the next 4 hours. Gomer began to apologize, telling the sergeant not to worry, but Sergeant Carter cut him off instantly, ordering him not to talk and to just listen. The sergeant stated that so far, it had been an absolute disaster all the way with Gomer, noting that the lieutenant was breathing down his neck. Gomer had gotten poor Dzansky into deep trouble, and he had let down the entire platoon. Sergeant Carter admitted that he ought to confine Gomer to the barracks immediately, but because they were short a man on the shift, he was putting him on this back gate because it was the simplest, most foolproof job in the entire world. The sergeant explained the rule with slow, deliberate clarity. All Gomer had to do was see to it that absolutely nobody got through the gate without showing their official military identification card. He remarked that a simple machine could easily perform the task, and expressed hope that maybe even Gomer could manage it. He gave Gomer a strict reminder that nobody gets in without their identification card, emphasizing that there were absolutely no exceptions and no listening to any hard luck stories whatsoever, commanding him to go strictly by the regulation book. Gomer nodded quickly, saying that he had it. Sergeant Carter ordered him to say the instruction back to him. Gomer recited it perfectly, stating that nobody gets in without their identification card, absolutely nobody, and he would not listen to any hard luck stories, choosing to go strictly by the book.